maybe even over, but through the hour. So with saying that, I do want to welcome Dr. Rugle. She brings 35 years of experience in the field of problem and responsible gambling, including treatment, prevention, research, and responsible gambling to her current positions. She has managed problem gambling programs within the Veterans Administration, which is you'll hear her experience in her talk today. She's also helped a lot of programs in the private sector within state systems. She's participated in research on brief screening for gambling problems, as well as a broad range of other problem gambling related research projects. She's provided consultation and training on gambling disorder through the U.S. for military and internationally. She's worked with responsible gambling specialists with the North American Association of State and Provincial Lotteries. She's the assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry, University of Maryland, and special projects consultant with the Maryland Center of Excellence on Problem Gambling. She is also, I saw her get this award, hit national. She's a 2019 recipient of Dr. Robert Custer's Lifetime Award for Direct Service awarded by the National Council on Problem Gambling. Dr. Rugle, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Robbie, and thank you all for being here and taking the time in this crazy, confusing, uncertain time on our globe. And so how do we address problem gambling among veterans? And certainly I worked at the VA for 18 years of my career and really cherish that time and the things I learned and how I grew as a person in working with this population. So let's get to it. All right. Here we go. So we want to talk about what are the aspects of military culture that contribute to risk for problem gambling and look at effective ways of opening up the conversation about the impact of gambling on health and well-being among active duty military and veterans. And that's my way of saying, how do we effectively screen for this issue? But I like thinking of it as a broader approach to screening in terms of how do we begin a conversation, not just look for problems. And addressing the connection between gambling problems and common co-occurring issues found among folks in the military. So already our first poll.
All right, let's launch the first poll question. And it asks, which, if any branch of the military are you in or have you served in? Never served in the military, B, Army, C, Navy, D, Air Force, E, Marines, F, Coast Guard, or G, married to a veteran or person in active duty. Just to get a feel of where you're at, of all of you folks that are on, which of any branch of the military are you in or have you served in? So we're almost at 90% now.
Yeah. Great. Well, yeah. Nobody has served in the military. Interesting. And yeah, I have not served in the military. And to give you some of my history, when I started at the VA, I was doing my internship, and then got hired on through a series of serendipitous events. But I'm a child of the 60s and the early 70s, and I wasn't volunteering for service in Vietnam, nor were most of my friends, and I was more likely to volunteer to be on the protest line. So coming into the military was into a military organization, into a veterans organization, was a very surreal experience for me. And I had to learn a lot because I needed a lot of attitude correction when I first came in. And so really appreciating what the military means, what being a veteran means, and learning to come to respect that was a really important part of my growth experience as a person and as a counselor. So today's military, we have 7 uniformed services, a bit over 2 million total service members, 1.5 million active duty, 800,000 reservists, led by our commander-in-chief. And let's just take a brief mindful breath at that thought. Led by acting secretary, and I always apologize in advance for anything I say that might offend somebody. So I apologize for that if anybody found that offensive. We wish him well and wisdom and humility. That's my mindful, loving kindness meditation for all our leaders. Mission to provide military forces to deter war and protect the security of our country. So why do we have to understand this culture? And it is a culture. It becomes part of a person's identity, no matter how briefly they were in the military, for the rest of their lives. And what does this culture and this identity mean? As much as any other ethnic culture, racial culture, gender culture, whatever culture, military culture has that deep a meaning for individuals who went through that experience. And so doing our best to understand that, or being informed by our clients if we're not, from that background, or working within a VA or veterans system. If you have a client who is former military or a veteran, ask, what was boot camp like? Tell me about it. Tell me your stories. I had an Uncle Bill, who was a World War II veteran and kind of the epitome of a grumpy old man. Served in the Philippines. If you know history, that was not a fun place to serve in World War II. And he was generally quiet about his military experience, except on holidays, because he came home from the war on Christmas Eve. And we would hear that story. And then, if you kind of got him in the right mood, he would bring out his book of photographs, which were just astonishing. And you could see and gradually understand the part of his identity and where that grumpy old man identity came from. The values continue to be critically important, and every veteran will have their unique story. Good, bad, the ugly, the indifferent, the painful, the funny, lots of stories. So get the storytelling, and that really helps to develop that therapeutic alliance. And it helps us understand how their unique individual story intersects with their unique individual gambling story. And we were talking, I was just on a supervision call before this, talking about the intensity, and boredom is such a thing often with folks with gambling disorder. Oh, when I'm not gambling, I'm bored. And boredom, don't accept it just at that word. I heard this morning an interesting definition. Boredom is not being interested. And so it's not our job to help people find other things to be interested in. For example, if I was in combat and I was in life and death situations, what is ever going to compare to how interesting that is in my life? If my brain's gotten used to that, so then I come home and I create chaos and I gamble to feel like I'm always living on the edge because that's the only way I feel alive. How do I help this person learn to be interested in more mundane aspects of life? To get out of that numbness without risking everything. So that's our therapeutic challenge in developing that appreciation for what it means to be alive, and how do we help people appreciate that, and understanding the perspective and context of veteran mental health conditions, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, traumatic brain injury, what we'll touch on as we talk about that. Um, and how does that fit into our treatment planning and appreciation for military service? It was interesting. I heard a presentation by a veteran who talked about his ambivalence when people came up to him and said, "Thank you for your service," because he didn't feel he had earned it. So, just being sensitive to how can we express our appreciation. And does that just, do you have ambivalence when people say that to you? And what's the best way for you to hear that? And being open to learning about what's the structure of the military, the different branches, what are the ranks? What does it take to earn different ranks? What effort has gone into that? What are the most respected ranks? And how do people relate to that? Um, for the last 38 years, or however many years, we haven't had a draft. It's been all volunteer. That's changed the nature of how people view the military. We don't have conscientious objectors anymore. Less than 1% of the US population wears a military uniform today, compared to 14% in World War II. So, like this group, nobody's had that experience, and you are much more likely to have your life touched upon by military experience in past generations. The services have been racially integrated since the late 40s, and overall minorities represent about a third of all active duty personnel. And often for folks in the highest problem gambling communities, those communities that are the most marginalized economically and socially, that are likely to have the highest rates of problem gambling, often minority communities, lower income, the military is a way out, one of the few way outs. Either I become a sports star, or I join the military, or either I go to jail or I join the military. So the opportunity presented by the military in communities where there are likely to be the highest levels of problem gambling needs to be appreciated. Women make up about 15% of all active duty personnel. However, they've been serving since World War I. Since '83, there's been a decrease in African Americans and an increase in Hispanics, although not dramatic increases and decreases. Currently, the average age is older than it had been previously, with somewhat higher education. And interestingly, the marital status is higher than in the civilian population, things you might not anticipate with the military. And this is a very busy slide, but it was a current snapshot, looking at what's the change. So the percentage of folks in the military is going down, and hopefully that will continue, and we won't have some major conflict that will increase the numbers in the military. Um, Female actually increasing, some projected over the next 30 some years. Decreased percentage of white. You see African American, that's very slight decrease over that time period, and pretty stable with other racial and minority groups. For the longest time, us baby boomers, the Vietnam era generation, were the highest percentage of veterans, of the veteran cohort. But as you can see, that will be significantly changing as we die off. whether from the virus or other things in the Gulf era. Operation Iraqi Freedom, Enduring Freedom, those groups become, and other groups probably, unfortunately. But I think what is interesting is Illinois is in the top 10 in percentage of veterans residing. And if you can see, the Black is a high percentage, and there's Illinois. I did not know that. Um, so that was surprising in the percentage of veterans in Illinois and ranking in the top 10. A word about women veterans tend to be younger, 58% between 20 and 29. They're likely to leave the service earlier in their military careers because of balancing career and family, and perceived lack of advancement opportunity for women still in the military, and issues of sexual assault and harassment. 40% of military women on active duty have children. Imagine that internal conflict if you're deployed out of the country. They're twice as likely to be a single parent and have a very high divorce rate. So, time for poll 2.
Okay, we'll launch poll number 2. And as I launch poll number 2, I apologize in advance. My 1-year-old bulldog has been barking. So I don't know if she is a veteran. I don't think she is, but she's had an opinion. So, okay, hopefully she'll stay down here. Okay, so what percentage of your clients are active duty or veterans? Is it A, 0 to 10%? Is it B, 11 to 25%? Is it C, 26 to 50%? Is it D, 51 to 75%? Is it E, 100%? Or F, you don't know. So what percentage of your clients that you see are active duty or veterans?
Great. I wonder if that one person 100% works at the VA.
Yeah.
So that's my question. Um, but yeah, mostly a very low percentage. Some don't know. And that's interesting. If you don't know, you're not asking. So whether your agency intake forms ask about military or veteran status, that's part of cultural sensitivity. So you might start including that if you don't know.
Very good point.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Um, so again, what is the military? It's not just a job. It is a way of life. And what's interesting, and really, especially around gambling, to appreciate about the military, and so many of my clients as veterans who came in with gambling problems did really, really well in the military. They were very successful. And not so good once they left the military. And part of that was the structure that the military provides. They tell you when to get up, what to wear, what to do, when to eat, how to make your bed, how to iron your structure for everything. And when you recognize either folks who were coming out of chaotic growing up situations, or the high percentage of folks with attention deficit disorder who also have a gambling disorder, that external structure and clarity really help them decrease their anxiety and have a way of organizing their experience and being successful in what they were doing. And then when they lost that, and there wasn't that way of organizing their lives, they really struggled. And gambling was that way of organizing my life that they fell into. Now, the outcome wasn't as helpful as the military, but there's not many other places where you can get that help with external organization of life. It's not a union or a fraternal organization, and there is tradition, just like you have family and cultural traditions and that you value, you know, in terms of foods and even food. You know, even the rations you got to take out in the field is part of that military tradition, and what they served in cafeterias, and each has its unique culture. You know, the Army and the Marines and the toughness of those, and the Air Force being the rebels of the military service and doing it their own way, and how do they get around some of the rules, and you know, so each has its own tradition, and it is governed by civilians. You know, the Department of Defense, you know, the head of that, often are civilians, so that the military has civilian oversight, and it gives purpose. It gives my life meaning. I'm serving the greater good. Where else do I have that opportunity? So, and gambling is about purpose. If I win, then winning is my purpose in life. And being all that you can be, I can get that in the military, or I can get that by being a winner in gambling. So why join? And let me see if this piece here can work and if people can hear. So this video really addresses why. Why would somebody join the military? Check it out, just looking at it.
Everyone starts from somewhere, but where you start doesn't have to be where you end.
There comes a time. There comes a time we have to make a decision. Let's go! Giving all I got. I ain't never gonna stop. On me changed my life. Gave me a new clock. Business on my head. NCO I led. When you trying to be better, you gotta lead a meds. On me values I came for. No stopping I can do. Misperception the army life. I'ma show you how to win though. Education you gon' get. No doubt we stay fit. What's like need 10 boosts? Airborne we stay lit.
Flipping out like an acrobat. I'm flipping the script like flipping through pictures on Flickr. You wanna grow up? Start with the one in the mirror. You gotta step forward just to be bolder. There's more to a soldier than just taking orders. There's more to a soldier than just taking orders. It's not about motors. 1775, known as the takeover. Uniform paid for, electric bill paid for, water bill paid for, living quarters paid for. Loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, earn more. Don't be a hostage to college, paying a mortgage, honor, integrity, personal courage, eating up beer like a bowl full of porridge. I'm above all, supporting and serving, I'm soaring. Confidence is pouring. The army, king of the jungle.
Giving all I got. I ain't never gonna stop. On me changed my life. Gave me a new clock. Business on my head. NCO I led. When you trying to be better, you gotta lead a meds. On me values I came for. No stopping I can do. Misperception the army life. I'ma show you how to win though. Education you gon' get. No doubt we stay fit. What's like need 10 boosts? Airborne we stay lit. 5 o'clock I'm gone. Persistence zone. Fat you want me to stop, but I want that bone. Body want me to quit. I fall, I trip. No, I keep getting back up. Cause I gotta have this. Hard words we came for. Persistence is simple. Blood, sweat, that's crucial. Late night is mental. No rest, the new quest. F4's the 5th set. I don't need no breaking this. On me train, I'm bringing sweat. Giving all I got. I ain't never gonna stop. On me changed my life. Gave me a new clock. Business on my head. NCO I led. When you trying to be better, you gotta lead a meds. On me values I came for. No stopping I can do. Misperception the army life. I'ma show you how to win though. Education you gon' get. No doubt we stay fit. What's like need 10 boosts? Airborne we stay lit.
You ever think we'll get this far?
Yeah, man, of course I did.
Hey, you in the Army? Yeah, we're in the Army. Oh, thanks for all you do. Oh, appreciate you.
Hey, thanks, man. Hey, you ever think about serving yourself?
I've thought about it, but honestly, I already have a good job. I got you. Hey, but let me show you something.
Okay.
So hopefully you're able to hear that, but it really talks about, you know, electric bill paid for, rent paid for, the sense of adventure, getting out of, stuck situations, flipping burger at McDonald's or whatever, and the challenge and, the identity, you've got this uniform and this is who you are and you can feel pride in that. And if you haven't gotten that in, school because you had a learning disability or attention deficit disorder, or, you were in an urban school that wasn't all that great, and you don't see where opportunity is, and you get to feel like, wow, this is something bigger than me that I can be a part of, is all addressed in that video. And for folks who've grown up playing video games, Call of Duty, they want that. And where else do you get that in life? The military, you see the planes and the guns that you're used to from your video games that made you feel good in your video games. And so let me do that. Let me live that. So lots of very important reasons for joining the military. Whoop, I can't go backwards. There we go. On the downside, we have issues like suicide. And imagine going into the military with those expectations, that this is going to be adventure, it's going to be the solution to my problems, it's going to give me that identity, and I'm going to serve a higher purpose. Yes, with most expectations, reality may not live up to that. So veterans have a suicide rate 50% higher than those who didn't serve in the military. In Iraq and Afghanistan, over 1,600 total deaths and 21% death by suicide. A huge number. Deployed veterans showed a lower risk of suicide compared to non-deployed veterans. And again, if I serve that purpose, I enlisted to serve a purpose, to fight for my country. And if I didn't get a chance to do that, and people I enlisted with did service, and maybe they died, then I start feeling ashamed and guilty and angry. That can contribute to suicidality. The suicide rate for female veterans, lower than for male veterans. Regardless of deployment status, the risk was higher among younger, male, white, unmarried, enlisted Army and Marine veterans. But the predictors were similar between male and female veterans. And when we look at the gambling piece, certainly being male, being younger, not being married, are also risk factors for problematic gambling. In addition to that risk factor, gambling is available on overseas bases, and the slot machines are operated by the military. The Government Accountability Office did a 2017 report, found that there were over 3,000 slot machines on overseas US military bases, and those had doubled since 2001. They generate money for the military. It goes into their recreation fund. So about $100 million a year, which is a substantial amount of money. And there are incredibly low rates for any screening for gambling disorder among active duty or among veterans, but this report focused on active duty, likely leading to incredible underreporting and underdiagnosis of any gambling related issues. So this is a table that looked at Department of Defense and Coast Guard service members who are seen by the military health system for pathological gambling, gambling disorder, and problem gambling. Now remember, they're not asking. So these represent only individuals who are likely to come in and say, you gotta help me, I've got a gambling problem. And that's about 0.03%. Which, if that's all you're looking at without understanding that there's no screening, there's no asking going on, and just as in civilian life where gambling disorder isn't covered under Americans for Disability, if you say you've got a gambling problem, you're really risking your career in the military. It's likely to affect your clearance status, among other things. So a lot of motivation to not acknowledge a gambling problem, along with the fact that nobody's asking about it in the system. However, medical professionals don't incorporate any screening questions specific to gambling disorder as they do for substance use or other behavioral health issues. Department of Defense and Coast Guard non-medical personnel do not have clear guidance about addressing gambling disorder. And you have to appreciate that there's guidance for everything you do in the military. There's a manual for it. There are guidelines for how you go about these things. Neither DOD's nor the Coast Guard's guidance for substance use explicitly include gambling disorders. So it's all written for substance use specifically, not even generally addictions. The guidance is specific for substance use disorders. DOD health officials stated that their substance use instruction implicitly covers gambling disorder. Of course, doesn't everybody understand when I say alcohol use disorder or amphetamine use disorder or substance use disorder that I also mean gambling? Well, of course, nobody understands that, if it even occurs to anybody to think about it. So not the best excuse. There are branches, among the branches, places where they're trying to address gambling. This is from a visit to Quantico, the Marine training base in Virginia. They had these posters up: when gambling is no longer a game, you lose, or you addicted, we will help you with this. And we did a 30-hour training for folks there. So some branches address it, but it's episodic. You know, it comes up and then it goes away. So there's very little sustained effort. And this is a video. This is the teaser for a video we did at the center in Maryland. And you can get the whole video on YouTube. And at the end, it's listed as one of the resources. But here's the teaser.
Gambling in the military, for me, it connected in numerous ways. First of all, it was initially starting with the camaraderie of gambling with fellow Marines. Gambling was more important to me than breathing.
And I think one of the most difficult things for any veteran or anyone in the military is to admit, I need help. So I started then delving into doing some things that were illegal and wrong. Charges were filed in the Marine Corps against me. At some point, I just had to say, you know what, Glenn, if you want to live this gambling, you're going to have to stop.
So that's the teaser. Hopefully you'll be interested in finding out more about Glenn's story. And let's see if I can get to the next slide. There we go. And in this slide, he tells more of his story. We talk about kind of general issues, and also his wife, who's also a psychologist, is interviewed and talks about living with someone in recovery from a gambling disorder. And as we talk about this, it's important also to recognize that the culture isn't just for the person in active duty or the veteran. Their family is part of that culture as well. Their children grow up in a military culture. Their spouses are part of that military culture, to the extent that you realize that for officer training, there are separate instructional classes and prerequisites for their spouses as well, to learn how to be a military spouse. So it's taken very seriously. So when we look at the general risk factors for gambling disorder, being male, African American, a young adult, coming from that high neighborhood disadvantage, marginalized communities, living close to a casino, and having any history of substance use or mental health disorders. This study looked at those risk factors for folks coming into the Air Force who might be identified as having gambling problems, and look at the similarities. The males, ethnic minority, low household income, binge drinking, physical fighting, cigarette or smoking or tobacco chewing. So with military and non-military, the risk factors for gambling are pretty comparable. The military factors, as Glenn was talking about in that brief snippet, you know, gambling provides the same kind of camaraderie. You know, my poker buddies, my racetrack buddies, my buddies at the casino, the competitiveness, be a winner, be all that you can be. And there's a tradition of gambling in the military. In World War II, in your kind of packet for going off into combat, you were given cigarettes and a deck of cards to deal with the hurry up and wait atmosphere, the military, the boredom, and the boredom with the anxiety of, you know, when is the battle going to start? And then when we're not in battle, what do I do with that anxiety about waiting for the next battle, or not knowing who's going to be an enemy when I leave our barracks? Who's going to be carrying a bomb? Where is that IUD going to be? And the loneliness of being away from home, whether you're stationed someplace in the States, but away from your family or overseas. The loneliness, certainly the trauma that can be involved, and the grief and loss of people you care about. And just that it's available. It's, you know, right on the bases overseas, and, you know, the casinos are right outside the base in many places in the States. U.S. veterans have been found to have elevated rates of problems with gambling compared to non-veterans in the most studies, and there haven't been that many. It's not been widely studied. Getting access to military and veteran populations isn't necessarily easy. You know, 4.2% in one study, 8% in another study. The results have been rather variable, and a lot of this has been based on methodology. Who's been asked in what way using what instruments. But the predominant finding is higher rates than in civilian populations. And the Whiting study done recently was really interesting because it really looked at post-active duty issues that were very important in contributing and increasing the risk for gambling problems. The post-deployment stressors most significantly were related to problem gambling rather than the during deployment stressors. Other than those who had higher harassment during their deployment or during their service, or an increased risk for gambling problems, whether they were shamed, and it wasn't just sexual harassment, any kind of harassment for not being able to do the obstacle course, for not being able to get things right or learn as quickly, or being a screw up, or having just a bad drill instructor who picked on you, whatever that was. But the post-deployment features were that lack of structure that we talked about, the lack of having a community and people I can relate to, my comrades, financial problems, not being able to find work post-deployment, relationship issues because my spouse doesn't understand this military culture, that I want things organized, that I want things orderly, that if I tell you to do something, you do it the way I told you to do it, or the trauma issues. And physical, you know, injuries, loss of limbs, emotional problems post-deployment. So important factors among veterans. Among veterans in active duty, 20% file for bankruptcy with gambling disorder, 50% have current or lifetime substance use along with their gambling. Veterans with gambling problems are 50% more likely to be homeless than veterans without gambling problems, 35% involved in domestic violence, 40% of veterans seeking treatment for gambling report a suicide attempt, and then the career and the family impact. The government accountability out of that report recommended that there be active screening for gambling disorder during routine medical appointments in primary care clinics, and particularly in other behavioral clinics. Include gambling disorder in the manuals. Don't leave it implicit. Make it really clear cut. Here's what you do for gambling disorder in all the branches. And we need to develop accurate screening tools and procedures. Critical points. All assessments for addiction and mental health should require assessing for gambling problems. Has that happened yet? Nope. And that was out of the National Defense Authorization Act, the Funding Act. Problem gambling can be a significant co-occurring issue and should be considered in all individuals with depression, PTSD, and traumatic brain injuries. Military health coverage should be included for this issue, and more research is needed. Great recommendations, but they haven't been mandated. So they're still not happening generally. And time for poll 3. Wake up, have to do something, have to respond.
Yeah. So for our third and final poll question, it asks, which of the following brief screens do you use in your practice or your agency? Is it the SOGS, A, South Oaks Gambling Screen, or is it B, the LIBET tool? Is it C, the brief biosocial gambling screen? Is it D, the problem gambling severity index?
Robbie, the poll doesn't seem to have popped up.
Oh, you know what? Well, no, that's operator
or
error.
just me.
No, that's operator error. That was
Okay,
Robbie.
great.
Okay, now that we can see it, guys, right? Oh, very good. Everybody's starting to answer. Which of the following brief screens do you use? Do you use the SOGS, the South Oaks gambling screen? Do you use the LiveBet tool? Do you use the brief biosocial gambling screen? Or D, the problem gambling severity index, or E, the gambling severity index, the GSI, or other, or G, none. So which of these screens do you use? Okay, we've got about 97%.
Okay,
Yeah, they're
great.
cruising right along.
All right, so room for growth. 9 people have room for growth, and including some questions about gambling. Great, great. Thank you all for those responses. Yeah, at least ask the question. It doesn't have to be like the military's don't ask, don't tell policy. Here's a caveat, though. What's interesting is those are lovely evidence-based brief screens. They work in the research. For example, if you're working in a substance use program, most of those screens, if you're using it in research, will find 20 to 50% of folks coming in for a substance use disorder will score positive on those brief screens for having some level of gambling problems. When you use those in actual clinical practice, you get about 1 to 3%. So we have to look at that. And this was a lovely study where they used the gambling screen, not just as part of a research protocol where they say, okay, you can be really honest here because we're going to keep your responses confidential. It'll be our little secret, and we're not going to tell your treatment providers, anybody else. It's not going to be in your medical record. So go ahead, be honest. And that's when you get 20%. But if you just put it in a real clinic where it would be in your medical record, like this study did, here's what happens. And they use the brief biosocial gambling screen. That is probably one of the better screens. They all work about pretty well. This one is, the language is a little less pejorative and stigmatizing than some of the other screens. But a nice screen to use. 3 questions. If you answer yes to 1, then that's positive. So they wanted to look at the rates of gambling disorder in this 1-hour intake in a primary care clinic for folks with mental health issues. And they screened over 200 veterans, most seen for anxiety and depression. 33% reported gambling in the past 12 months, which is somewhat low to begin with. Most common gambling was lottery. And when you work in any publicly funded program, the most common form of gambling is going to be lottery. And in general, when you ask adults about gambling, you get the highest rate saying, yeah, I play the lottery. Of 85 veterans who gambled, about 6% endorsed at least one of the screening instruments. 3 of those 5 were later diagnosed using diagnostic procedures with a gambling disorder, and all had a diagnosis of depression and endorsed suicidality. The prevalence of at-risk and problem gambling in the complete sample, not just those who say they gambled in the last year, was about 2%, which in a behavioral health clinic is rather low since you expect increased rates above the general adult rate, which would be 1 to 2%. So we're not finding what we might expect to find. They dug deeper in this study. So they asked questions about how much have you spent a month on gambling. So of those who spent $100 or more, 2 endorsed one of the screening questions. and 11 didn't endorse any, and 2 weren't screened. Of those who didn't endorse any of the screening items, no, this isn't a problem for me, 3 of those said they were spending about $1,000 or more a month. Now, either those were incredibly rich veterans, which is highly unlikely, or they're just not saying this is a problem, even though they're probably spending more on gambling than is good for them. Of the 2 veterans who are not screened, who didn't take the screen, one reported spending $450 a month and the other $1,600 on gambling in the past month. Either they've been saving up for the past month to go to Vegas for the last 10 years, or there may be an issue here. So when you ask about gambling activities in a different way, not just diagnostic level questions, if you just ask something that isn't so judgmental or so obviously problematic, like, are you a liar? Do you lie about your gambling? But you say, well, how much did you spend in the last month? You may get more of an inkling that maybe this is having some sort of impact on this person's life and something we might talk about. So some best screening practices include the brief screen questions on intake. Just don't expect that you're going to get the full story if those are the only questions you ask, especially if you just come out and say, oh, do you ever lie about your gambling? And you haven't defined what you're talking about in terms of gambling. People don't think of the lottery as gambling. So mostly they're playing the lottery and spending over $1,000 on it. But when you say, do you gamble much? They'll say no, because lottery isn't gambling. Repeat the screen after relationship and trust are established. For example, when you're doing treatment plan updates, it's not one and done. Keep making it a part of the conversation. And many clinicians really think it's more effective if you also include the screen when you're doing some sort of psychoeducation on what's gambling like in your life. Not the problem gambling lecture, but how do you have fun with your money discussion. This is a questionnaire. It's a leisure activities questionnaire that Leah Nauer at Rutgers uses. And she starts out, before asking any screening questions, just how often do you participate in any of these activities? And notice she doesn't even use the word gambling. So it can be one way of defining what you're talking about. And then when she asks the screening question, she just would say, how often have you not told people you care about whether or not you've engaged in any of these activities? And she puts off using the word gambling for as long as possible, because researchers show that even the word gambling carries an implicit stigma around it. So people are not likely to endorse any gambling activities. Co-occurring issues we've talked about. Among those identified with at-risk gambling, there have been found to be higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, traumatic brain injury, panic disorder, and suicide attempts and ideation. And it goes the other way around too. So there are higher rates of problematic gambling among those who come in diagnosed with PTSD, depression, traumatic brain injury, and panic disorder. So in that clinic where it was for folks with these conditions, you would expect higher rates of problem gambling in that group. And just the range of research that's shown very high rates of post-traumatic stress among those with gambling problems and the other way around. For those with issues like post-traumatic stress, gambling is the solution, not just financially, but emotionally. gambling in a psychodynamic kind of strange way undoes the trauma. If I win, it will undo any harm I've done, not just my gambling harm, but any harm I've done in my life. It will erase it. It will be the cure for any guilt and shame I feel, either at not having served in combat or done things in combat that I really don't feel good about. And money will make me invulnerable, you know, and especially when there's been a history of abuse, trauma, sexual, physical, prior to the military. You know, if I've got this money, I'm never going to be abused again. I'm never going to be vulnerable again. It doesn't, you know, that's not the reality, but that's the perception. The gambling losses just reenact the chaos and the trauma of combat and risking it all. Just like with PTSD, gambling can lead to a feeling of dissociation where I'm apart from my painful reality. And I can have a sense of safety. When I'm at my machine, I'm in this safe bubble. And we talked about the intensity and the aliveness of putting everything on the line and how that relates to the challenge of military, whether it's combat or just passing the physical endurance tests that you have to pace, and feeling so alive when I put it all, when I do my best. And those who have post-traumatic stress along with gambling, those co-occurring issues, there's also a higher rate of negative emotionality than just having one of those disorders. There's a greater use of gambling to cope with those negative emotions, greater emotional distress in general, and greater suicidality, greater likelihood to seek mental health treatment and high-end inpatient or residential services. Preference in Lisa Najavit's work for getting PTSD treatment rather than just gambling treatment or co-occurring treatment. So, and other literature has said that folks are much more likely to seek treatment for mental health or substance use issues than they are for their gambling issues. And just a large number of psychiatric comorbidities along with the gambling. So what do? Be aware that when we're treating one disorder, we're probably treating multiple disorders. That people are likely to have at least one other co-occurring disorder along with their gambling. And address the whole person. Be aware that veterans are likely at risk for both or a whole range of mental health and addiction issues along with the gambling. And that folks with post-traumatic stress disorder and gambling are going to be difficult cases. You know, they're likely to be particularly distressed, dealing with a lot of impulsiveness, a lot of emotional pain, shame, guilt, along with the trauma. Consider both disorders as focus for treatment, or be prepared to make referrals to someone competent to treat what you can't. If you're competent with the gambling, but I'm not a trauma processing expert, and you think this person is ready for and needs specific trauma processing, then know where the program is to refer those folks. If you're a specialist in trauma, then know where to refer if you're not comfortable doing the gambling, and if your client wants that specialized treatment. If your client isn't motivated to get the specialized treatment, then it's incumbent on us to know how to connect the dots, at least connect their trauma with the gambling. Mindfulness, one of my favorite ways of working, addresses all of the issues and the underlying issues, so you can focus on the mindfulness that can have impact on multiple issues, mental health as well as gambling. And of course, I love this poster. You can be strong and mindful at the same time. At Quantico, this was their motto for their behavioral health services, not just gambling. Protect what you have earned, and that's utilizing military language that can be related to in that military culture. Protect what you have earned and what your family deserves. And here are some resources that will be posted on the website, so you don't have to madly copy them down. And I've exceeded my time limit as predicted, Robbie.
Yeah, it's okay, Dr. Rugle. I love hearing your 18 years of experience, working at the VA and how it laid out. And like I said, I've heard you talk live before I even heard Glenn speak. And it was great to see him too, especially how he connected his camaraderie to this nasty disorder. It's so, but we appreciate it. We appreciate everyone who were able to stay on a little bit later. If you had to drop off, we understand. But again, thank you, Dr. Rugle. We did have one quick question. If you've got,
Sure.
well, we've got a comment too. And Marie, thank you, Marie. She had asked me, and I have not seen the commercial for the Army, which looks like a video game. Have you seen that?
Boy, I forgot to look up that link, and I may have that link, and I can send it to you if I can track it down.
Okay, yeah, I haven't seen it yet.
It's on YouTube. Yeah. I don't know that it's aired. It's more of a YouTube kind of link rather than a TV commercial link. So let me see if I can track it down.
Okay. And no worries, Christine. You got to go. You got everybody. You can leave if you need to. And the other question was, are there studies? Oh, thank you, Ellen. We've getting a lot of thank yous as I speak. Are there any studies regarding, this is a good question, gambling in a specific branch, like the National Guard? Marie was asking about the National Guard, if you know of any studies.
I know there's been work done with the National Guard and with the reserves. Now, I can't remember if that's been published in accessible journals.
Okay.
But I know there certainly are increased rates of gambling among reservists.
Okay.
And in the National Guard as well. And there was that one Air Force study. And I think there's been a Navy study as well. But yeah, not enough, and not large enough samples across all services.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you, Dr. Rugle, and I particularly thank you for some of the best practices. The one for screening, I really thank you. It's not a perfect, there's some interpretation and somewhat of an art, to see if you have to dig further, right? So I appreciated that as well. So, well, listen, we look forward to the next one. And this Thursday, same bat time, same bat channel, we're going to have Dr. David Ledgerwood presenting on motivational interviewing and cognitive distortions. And thank you again, Lori. Thank you. It was a great presentation. Okay, have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.